Chris, and welcome to another episode of the Community Development Podcast. My name is Russell Todd, and I am in the plush, leafy surroundings of Llandaff campus of Cardiff Metropolitan University, and I have the pleasure of the company of Dr Jan Huyton. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining me, and we're going to be talking community philosophy today, and an organisation called Philosophy in Pubs, and how grassroots communities, grassroots activists, the normal man or woman in the street can engage with issues to do with philosophy, can engage with the great issues that are kind of affecting communities and people, but in a very sort of grounded way, in a very safe, informal way. I have a particular theory that particularly some of the government-funded programmes I've been involved in, a bit of that bigger picture has been lost, and that desire to kind of critique some of these things a little bit more fundamentally is kind of been lost and eroded a little bit. But before we do that, what do people need to know about you?
Well, I guess I'm speaking pretty much from a personal perspective, in that in my personal life I belong to the Raymond Williams Foundation, which is an organisation devoted to taking forward the work of the late great Raymond Williams in terms of community learning amongst adults. And also the organisation Philosophy in Pubs, which is another grassroots voluntary organisation that is genuine voluntarism. It's an organisation that came together organically out of an interest and a love of philosophy and doing philosophy in public places. And that's where my passion for community philosophy developed, where I could see how transformative it was in a genuine community development kind of way for me as an individual, and also for the people who were taking part. And the method that's used, the community of enquiry approach, which is quite a democratic way of philosophising about an issue, has also been really useful for developing critical thinking skills in my professional life with students at Cardiff Metropolitan University in the School of Education, where I currently work. So that's been very, very helpful as well in terms of helping people, whether they're community development workers or other kinds of professionals, to actually reflect critically and analyse their own practice and the policy context, which perhaps increasingly, as you mentioned earlier, we're not being encouraged to do quite so much.
So you talk about learning, you talk about reflection. These are some of the things that I'm trying to encourage people to do more of. Within the community development sector, with that workforce, or even people who do that sort of work without necessarily recognising that they are a community development worker, or that would even identify necessarily with that as a sector or as a profession. But if people don't know who Raymond Williams was, he has a society, so clearly he's somebody important.
There's a society and a foundation.
And a foundation, sorry. If people don't know, then who was Raymond Williams?
Well, Raymond Williams is a very important Welshman who was born on the Welsh-English border in a place called Pandy, which is quite close to Herefordshire, but it's in what is now Monmouthshire. He was the son of a railway worker. I think his father was a railway signalman, and he eventually ended up going to Cambridge University, where he developed an interest in the education of adults. So despite being a great scholar in an academic context, he used his passion and his knowledge about education to spread the word in more of an adult and community education context. And we're very lucky that there's the Raymond Williams Society, which is an academic organisation that produces a scholarly academic journal called Keywords. But there's the Raymond Williams Foundation, which I'm a member of, is run by an administrator called Derek Tatton, and Derek was actually one of Raymond Williams' students. So the fact that he knew Raymond Williams means that there's a great deal of resonance with taking forward Raymond Williams' personal and professional aims and outcomes.
And I remember when you first mentioned this whole sort of movement, I think it's fair to say, a bit underground.
Philosophy in Pubs.
Yeah, I thought it was anyway, because I hadn't kind of heard of it, but you were telling me, there's one here and there's one there. I would lap that sort of thing up. And admittedly, I did latch onto the pubs word first rather than philosophy, and it's not, maybe disappointingly for some, it's not just pubs, but it's public
Public places, philosophy in public places, public spaces. And we did begin in pubs in Liverpool. Paul Doran, who's the national coordinator at the moment, and a guy called Rob Lewis. I think Paul was a WEA tutor teaching philosophy, having come to education later on in life, as many of us did. And I think Rob was one of the students on the WEA course, and they were just having a tutor-student kind of philosophical discussion in a pub, and I think Rob just came up with the idea that, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could do this on a regular basis? And so the idea of philosophy in pubs was born in Liverpool, and I've actually done a few interviews with people who were involved with the development of philosophy in pubs right at the start, and I know that Paul and a few of the other sort of early members of philosophy in pubs were quite small in number occasionally, and Paul talks of sitting on his own in a pub with a sign saying philosophy in pubs here, and just sitting there on his own week after week until eventually people came along to join. The idea of having it in a public space is that in a genuine grassroots community development sort of methodology, really, that people might just be in a pub or a cafe or wherever the philosophy is taking place and overhear what's going on and have the opportunity to join in. So true, genuine grassroots open access organisation, really.
And I love that sort of organic nature of how it might, happen and then evolve. And I'm kind of quite taken with that, with the notion. I've got this picture of this sort of lonely man in a pub with a sign, and everybody wondering who the hell is that guy.
Well, I've been a lonely woman in a pub in Wales trying to do the same thing.
But then, I can remember being a lonely community worker on an estate and, knocking doors and getting no reply, or trying to engage with people ultimately, which is what that is about, I guess, and not having a huge amount of joy. And it can be a bit demoralising, and you can kind of, not see, question kind of, why people aren't getting this. This is an opportunity for them. This isn't going to be an enjoyable thing. But of course, you don't know what kind of baggage, what pre-experiences those other people have had that sort of says, well, actually, philosophy is a word maybe that's only for certain people to do.
Well, that is one of the issues. And occasionally people might say, should we use the word philosophy? Is it putting people off? And in the interviews that I did with people who belong to philosophy in pubs and other community philosophy organisations, for example, the University of the Third Age tends to have philosophy groups. There's discussions in pubs with the Raymond Williams Foundation, and there are other philosophy groups that take place in the community that aren't necessarily part of the philosophy in pubs network as such. And the idea is that we're democratising the word philosophy and we're trying to make it less elitist. So on the one hand, yes, because it does have those elitist connotations, it might put people off. But if we say, we're not going to use the word philosophy, then we're almost capitulating to the fact that philosophy only belongs to a certain educated elite, and we're basically rolling over and saying, yes, that's what we're doing isn't really philosophy. So those two arguments, trying to get a balance between the two, is often quite a moot point, really. And ultimately, I think taking ownership of the word philosophy usually wins out. And what people say is, if we've got a sign up saying philosophy in pubs, to say what philosophy actually means, or to use word of mouth to let people know, or maybe something like this where I have the opportunity to speak to anybody who's listening to explain that what we mean by philosophy, yes, it can include formal philosophy and philosophers. So occasionally we might have Enlightenment philosophers, European philosophers, we might have ancient philosophers like Aristotle and Socrates and so on. But ultimately it's about a process of philosophizing about the important issues of the day and inspiring people to continue to think about those issues. So often the thinking starts during the philosophy dialogue and discussion and continues afterwards. Certainly that's what I find, and that's what a lot of people have told me they find as well. And when I use that process with students at Cardiff Met, they're telling me that as well. We make discoveries, we make transformative discoveries about ourselves, but it also inspires us then to look for other avenues of thought on that topic. And social media is really quite helpful as well. There's so much that I share with people and that I pick up from Twitter that helps conversations and discussions continue. So we were philosophising or using a community of enquiry approach about the topic of equity in one of my classes at Cardiff Met last week, and I've been able to engage with one of those students who wants to continue that dialogue via Twitter, basically exchanging podcasts, links and information just to sort of deepen and continue that thinking, which we can then share with the other students when we get back next week.
I can remember, just relating this to something it was a sort of discussion I was privy to back last year within the Communities First programme in Wales. It was in Cardiff, and where we're recording, but it was in one of the estates in the west of the city, and somebody had sort of said, well, actually found myself having to find out a little bit more about 0 hours contracts and 0 hours employment. And she said, because one of the interesting things for me is that we've actually had a couple of people we supported into work, big drive within Communities First to get people back into employment. And what she said was that it's almost kind of like a received wisdom in this role, in this sort of programme, that 0 hours is bad, it's exploitative, and I think ultimately there is a lot in that. But actually for one or two of her clients that she was supporting back into work, it actually helped them adjust with work, so that actually a few hours this week gives actually a little bit of time next week with fewer hours, just to kind of continue with that adjustment back into a routine of work for people who've been out of work for a long time. And so she said, for the right person, maybe those sorts of roles aren't exploitative. And what she was kind of going through this process of, actually, I'm having to find out a little bit more. I'm having to kind of realise that actually I was just kind of taking other people's word for how bad these things are, and finding out actually for some employers you can be a little bit more ethical in your employment of people, even though ultimately on paper it is a 0 hours arrangement. Now, whether for those individuals, and I think this is critical, whether she was, she also recognised if these people are still on 0 hours contracts maybe in 2 years' time, well, actually there's a chance that those are no longer suitable for those individuals. And I just thought that was really, really interesting as somebody within the Communities First programme who's got targets to meet, clients to help support into work, but actually kind of going, I need to look at these individuals as primarily individuals first and foremost, and actually for some people it's not this bad thing, this exploitative thing, it's actually helping them into work.
Well, I was interested to hear you use the term received wisdom, because that is something that can affect us. Yes, you mentioned things like targets and so on that we need to work towards, and that can be something that does sometimes perhaps cause the blinkers to come up when we're forced to work towards targets and so on. But also, just generally speaking, there can be certain received wisdom, certain accepted professional truths that nobody is prepared to challenge. And the idea of the community of enquiry approach, where you're philosophising and you are listening to other people's perspectives, and as part of the dialogue you're having is that you need to actually develop an argument and be quite persuasive in terms of providing, I don't particularly want to use the word evidence-based, but certainly some sort of reasoning as to why you have the position you have, and be open to other people's reasoning and to learn and transform. That's the important thing about it. So I've found it really helpful in professional education, because I've been working in higher education for quite a long time and always working on professionally qualifying programmes, including community development, education, housing and so on. But that very process is also really helpful in other contexts where received wisdom exists. Where we have situations where people simply believe what they read in the paper, for example. Often I've been in community philosophy groups as a participant, and someone's come up with something perhaps rather crass that they've read in the Daily Mail or something. So other papers are available. I'm sorry to demonise the Daily Mail there, but the people in the group were then able to find perhaps an elegant way of actually challenging that person, rather than getting into some sort of less constructive argument about it. When I've used the community philosophy approach when working with prisoners, there have been occasions where some of the young men that I've been working with have said, well, it's really great to learn how to have these discussions and dialogues, and to learn how to disagree with people without having to use your fists, without having to win in that sort of, and also not having to win at all, just being happy not to have to win an argument, but to be content to maybe not to come to a conclusion and to continue thinking about it. I guess as well, there have been particular situations in a prison context where, for example, fairly recently, a smoking ban was introduced in prisons in Wales. A lot of people are surprised at that because people thought that smoking was banned already, but it hadn't been. And at the particular prison I was working in, there was quite a lot of unrest, and people were a bit concerned and not seeing things from a range of perspectives, but seeing it from their own perspective in terms of whether they were a smoker or a non-smoker, the fear of the consequences that might occur as a result of this smoking ban coming in. So we were looking at philosophers who deal with issues around freedom and free will to actually consider different perspectives by, if you like, taking the personal out of it and using philosophy and what philosophers had said to explore how the young men I was working with in the prison felt about the smoking ban coming in, and maybe what the root of their unease was, and maybe seeing it from other people's perspectives and so on. And they really took to that with great interest and managed to see things from a range of different perspectives, which again was a way of sort of challenging received wisdom, if you like, because they're quite entrenched in their own positions.
Yeah, and as you say, probably ways in which they tackle disagreements within a certain, again, a received wisdom. This is how you deal with disagreement, this is how you deal with dissenting voices.
Yeah, and I know, and many of them would comment during the inquiries about the fact that where there were issues around choice and thinking things through and whatever, realising that they were in prison because of the consequences of choices that they'd taken and because of risks that they had chosen to take. And that's quite an empowering way to look at a personal situation, to sort of philosophise about it from a perspective of it being a choice that you've taken or a risk that you've taken and the consequences that you are now experiencing as a result of that. And I think it helped them think about a way forward. But I think what I found particularly I suppose, and enlightening for me was that the young men that I was working with in the prison context were really, really clever, really bright young men who took to the philosophy really, really very easily, and they found it really interesting and fascinating. We used a range of different stimuli to actually produce philosophical dialogue together. And I just felt a little bit sad, really, that had they had the opportunity to use their cleverness and their interest in philosophising in more productive ways, they might not have found themselves in a position that they were in, because they'd used their cleverness perhaps in ways that had resulted in them being in prison, and they acknowledged that.
You said earlier that there is that element around trying to democratise things, and in many ways prisoners are very, because of their own choices they've taken and the risks that they've kind of calculated, but nonetheless are very marginalised.
Yes.
And arguably remain quite marginalised even when they leave prison.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even if they, no longer offending or anything like that, they remain marginalised. So actually, in this way, where people are able to philosophise around issues, whether it's related to themselves and their circumstances or it's other issues, I think it's fascinating that the democratic element allows, demonstrably in that instance, quite a wide range of people to be potentially involved. Yeah,
and my concern's always been that there should be more community philosophy groups, so that if somebody who's in whatever situation, whether we're talking a prison context or other sort of situations where maybe somebody's in a particular situation and the philosophising approach is being used as an intervention, perhaps, that they can then have that sort of that social skill or that interest and belong to a community group and continue to take it forward as part of simply being in the community and learning how to be with people. I think that, well, if thinking historically, it used to be the case that people would philosophise in community contexts, perhaps more so men than women. I'm thinking in particular about is it Gwyn Thomas, the writer from the Rhondda, who wrote about his experiences growing up in the Rhondda, and he was writing about how young the book The Dark Philosophers, where he was talking about how young men would meet in cafes and they would discuss sort of, I suppose, local political issues which had larger ramifications for them. And I think the fact that we have to make that happen now by getting a group together or something, rather than it happening just as part of ordinary social life does concern me a bit. And we all know the reasons why people don't have those sort of dialogues and discussions as much as they used to. But the fact that philosophy in pubs and the Raymond Williams Foundation and other groups do exist to take that forward, I hope, is a way of trying to get that back as a normal part of life and society.
Dark Philosophers is one of my favourite books and is absolutely brilliant. And it is very visceral actually. There's a very scene very early on because it's a book comprised of sort of 3 novellas really, where they're in one of the traditional Italian cafes in the valleys, and it's talking about the sort of the hiss of the coffee machine, and it's the aroma, and it's the sort of the dark, sultry looks of the beautiful staff, because they're Italian, and it's really kind of visceral in that way. But if you know that environment, so you've been in those sorts of cafes, and I think there is something particularly, I think, romantic and nostalgic about the valleys ones. There's Italian cafes in Cardiff, for instance. But when you're in the valleys as well, I think there's something just that little bit more sort of exotic about it. Indeed, erotic is I think is a word that Gwyn Thomas uses, and all the characters that they use about that setting. But they are talking about big issues.
Yeah.
But you get a sense in that book as well that it's not just them, and the protagonists are the dark philosophers. But it's not just them. There's other people having their own sort of discussions in there.
Yes. Yeah.
And it was this kind of nexus of all of these different conversations kind of taking place, all against this backdrop of the hissing and the plopping and the consumption of the coffee.
And it's not to say that those places no longer exist at all whatsoever, but they're less likely. You're less likely to come across that sort of situation. So we started groups in Pontypridd, Treorchy, Cardiff, and so on, and they are quite self-sustaining because people really want to go along to them. And I've also had community development workers talk to me about maybe trying to get some training for the community development workers so that they can help the communities that they're working with to actually start thinking about concepts such as social justice or social injustice, equity, and so on, and different political concepts that underpin the situations that they're trying to deal with, in some ways to make them more motivated to be activists.
And I have this theory. We've been talking in Wales as with the demise of or the planned demise of the Communities First programme, and Welsh Government's desire to replace it with this new approach to building resilient communities, quote unquote. And I've heard people talking about how they want to consult with communities and things like that. And I just look at it. Well, actually, when you're throwing out words, then not statements, but words like resilience and resilient communities and building a new approach, all those sorts of terminologies and words and phrases. Actually, that's not consultation. You need to be much more fundamental and go, actually, well, what are we actually talking about? What is resilience? What does resilience mean to you? It might mean something different to me.
Absolutely.
On gender grounds. It might mean something different to people who, post-Brexit, people from ethnic minority communities post-Brexit are now actually being harassed much more just because of their creed or their faith or how they're dressing or whatever. And actually some broader definition of resilience, whatever that might be, actually needs to be part, because they're much more pressing concerns. And as community development workers, we kind of go, actually you need to work on those more pressing things initially with people before they can kind of articulate bigger, broader visions sometimes.
Yeah.
And certainly map out how they get to there and realise those things. And I just wonder whether actually consultation in this instance within communities in Wales, or the Communities First communities in Wales, is almost a little bit premature. It's actually, let's get a little bit more fundamental now.
Yeah.
And I actually think this sort of approach, community philosophy approach, it's timely anyway. It would always be a great addition to communities, but I actually think it's even more necessary now with where we're at. Because there's a danger that actually the definition of resilience then, just to focus on that word, that wins out is going to be the definition articulated by government, by local authorities, by councillors, by those people who are used to articulating their voice and shaping policy and programmes.
Absolutely, and so they've got the confidence and the oratory skills, I suppose, to be able to put that information across. And what taking part in a community philosophy group does is help people to develop those skills within a safe and nurturing environment, because there are ground rules, particularly for organisations which have an affiliation to philosophy in pubs, which is that you do show care and concern towards your fellow philosophers, if you like, and that people are very careful to be critical and challenging, but in a caring and considerate sort of way. And those are the sort of skills as well that people have told me they would like to develop with people who are maybe on management committees or governing bodies and so on. Just the ability to have those discussions and dialogues in a very measured and considerate sort of way. So I have suggested this method as something we could maybe offer some training for, where people are trying to upskill boards, for example. You hear all the time where people are looking for community board members or tenant board members, but those board members can't necessarily have an equal status in those committees because A, they don't necessarily have the information that they ought to have, and B, they don't necessarily have the skills and the ways in which they can articulate the ideas that they might want to put across. So a lot of people who I've spoken to about the benefits that they get from taking part in a community philosophy group have said that it does give them those the skills and the confidence to be able to put their point across and to be able to question and to be able to notice things and unpick things. I always remember one of my students, who was actually quite a senior local authority member of staff, who used to go to an awful lot of committees, the pact committees with the police.
Sadly, yes, I do.
We were talking about questioning and basically looking at arguments and questioning those arguments as to how rational they were and how genuine they were. And this guy just had this eureka moment, and he said, a particular agency has been telling me about some statistics, and I've just swallowed what they've been saying, or they've been making a particular argument about how we ought to intervene in a certain situation. And now that I'm beginning to realise how to think about these things and question these things, I've got a completely different perspective on this. And each week he used to come back to me and say, I've been talking to so-and-so, and I've managed to question and notice maybe flaws in their arguments and so on. And this was really quite a big professional moment for him in that he recognised that actually he had previously almost been a victim of other people's rhetoric because he didn't have the thinking skills to question it. So I think it helps professionals as well as members of the community.
So you talked a bit earlier about the community of inquiry approach, and what I like about that, based on some of the stuff that I've read kind of leading up to this, and I think this really chimed with me again, looking at this through a sort of a community development prism, is that aims for participants to gain as much from the process as they do from the actual topic.
Yes, absolutely.
And we talk about this, and certainly the episode we recorded with Alan 12 Trees again was talking about it's not always just the end, but how you work towards it and the means towards that end is really, really critical when you're working with communities. And we might look at that in terms of capacity building and supporting the development of a management group or of a community group of some description. But that is as important as working towards, whether it's campaigning against a road was one of the examples that Alan used, whether it's campaigning to save a rural school that I've been involved in, or to save a community centre, or whatever it might be, that actually the process is as important.
Very much so.
Arguably more so, because that then lends itself to them as community members being that much more articulate and confident and assertive and able then for when the next campaign needs to be commenced. Yeah. So in terms of that community of inquiry approach, because there's 4 key principles, you talk about the 4 C's, can you kind of illustrate the way in which the process then is as important?
Okay, well, the 4 C's that you've just mentioned there, they do originate in the Philosophy for Children community of inquiry model that was first put forward by Matthew Lipman, who is an American educationalist. So we talk about caring thinking, which is making sure that you are considerate and caring towards other people so that you're not shouting people down, and that one of the ways in which that can be taken forward in a group is that there's often a process of turn taking. I mean, each group will eventually develop its own way of doing things, but certainly at the start where a group is first developing, it'll be turn taking. There'll be a facilitator, and people will speak in turn, and they won't shout people down, and they'll be respectful towards other people. It needs to be collaborative in that everybody needs to be able to have a role in the process, and part of the caring side of things is making sure that everybody can collaborate and take part. Having said that, when I've spoken to people about, I've actually taken part in a number of different enquiries with a range of different groups throughout the UK, mostly in Liverpool, I have to say, but in other areas as well. And I've also interviewed people about their experiences. And there are people who start off on the periphery. They're quite quiet and shy, and eventually they develop the confidence or the social skills to be able to take part. Or sometimes they just remain on the periphery, and that's understood and accepted, and people have their recognised role within the group, and the caring approach towards that is you can be however you want to be. But equally, when we're talking about collaboration, sometimes there are people who join groups who really are quite shouty and quite dominating, and they want to make sure that they get their voices heard, and actually what they want to do is to showcase themselves. We all know these people, they exist, they live and work amongst us. And what tends to happen, people have said to me, is that somebody who is like that, perhaps because they don't realise that that's not the way a philosophy in pubs group might work, they will either modify their behaviour or they will leave. Mm-hmm. Because if they want to be the person who shouts and wants to have an argument and wants to make themselves heard and wants to win and wants to find the right answers to things, then philosophy in pubs really isn't for them, which is why it's really helpful to have those two C's, collaborative and caring. But then there's also the importance of critical thinking and creative thinking. The idea that critical thinking to encourage people to question, to recognise logic and to be able to develop and evaluate arguments, and creative thinking to come up with new thoughts and ideas, and perhaps to be transformative for either ourselves or our communities. Often what I'll do if I'm working with a group who are sort of developing around the 4 C's, we have occasionally we'll stop and we'll evaluate how we're doing on the 4 C's, because there's little descriptors as to how well we're doing under each of the C's. And sometimes groups will say, well, we're doing really well on the caring and the collaborative side of things because we're all being nice to one another and we're all having our turn taking and so on. But maybe that's stopping us from being critical, or maybe that's stopping us from challenging one another and so on. So being able to evaluate how the group is going and to recognise where maybe some of the 4 C's are preventing others from happening.
Because there's this concept, isn't it, with social media, that people end up just following and interacting with like-minded people, that it then becomes an echo chamber.
Yeah.
And then why you get the flare-ups on social media, I think Twitter's great for this, is because people with quite divergent views, perhaps because they don't tend to hear other views, that when they do then kind of clash, then it becomes quite a bit of a sort of a flashpoint then, if you like.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, because I was thinking as we were having this discussion that, yes, I do engage in quite a lot of philosophical exchange on Twitter, but it's disembodied. It doesn't particularly give people social skills. It does lead to the sort of flashpoints, like you're saying, and people feel somehow emboldened to treat people quite badly on Twitter because it's a disembodied comment that somebody's making, or that you're not necessarily going to have to deal with any sort of comeback. Whereas in a face-to-face group context, then you do need to learn and to get used to being appropriate, being caring and collaborative, whilst at the same time being creative and critical in that face-to-face context. I've mentioned that I think it's really important that philosophy, to me it's important that the community philosophy groups are sort of develop organically, and that's really the key to their sustainability, which is that people really want them to happen, people really want to take part, and that's why so many groups are currently running and having so many people turning up sometimes the groups run weekly and they get a really good turnout each week, sometimes they're monthly or whatever, depending on what the group wants. But I have also done, as I mentioned, some work in prisons. I've also done some work through widening access initiatives at Cardiff Met, where we've developed we tend to call them philosophy clubs, because they're groups of people who come together for a fixed period of time to learn how to do community philosophy, and also if they want to, if that's what the group wants, to learn about philosophers as well. So it can be quite nice to combine a stimulus which actually looks at what a philosopher says with the actual process of philosophising about that issue. And some of those groups have wanted to continue to meet A community development worker would always want to be able to walk away from a situation and know that the group would continue without them. You know, we sometimes hear it described as an exit strategy, but you know, I think perhaps it's just about making sure that when you're working with a group, you're giving them the skills to be self-sustaining and that you're not encouraging dependency. And one group I think of particularly that continues to meet on a regular basis, continues to meet weekly, they've told me that they get so much out of the group in terms of friendship as well as stimulating dialogue, because you can go to many different groups where you can meet people in a friendship sort of context, but these are clever people who really have discovered philosophy, discovered philosophical dialogue, and they want to have those discussions and so on. And what people in that group have told me, because I do try to go along to that group when I can, is that it means so much to them. It's changed their lives in so many ways, in terms of perhaps some of them have maybe suffered from difficulties in their lives, various different forms of health or mental health issues, and ultimately the group has just transformed their lives tremendously, and they continue to meet. They're motivated to meet. They don't need the intervention of a worker, and it's almost like the ideal situation where you'll have an intervention for 6 or 8 weeks and then the group continues afterwards. So that's what I have found so I guess so useful in terms of what community development workers might be trying to achieve, which is that it does develop genuine, organic, voluntary community activity.
There was an event here, wasn't it, at Cardiff Met last year, I think it was September 2016, it was around community philosophy.
Yes.
And although I wasn't unfortunately able to make it, I can remember somebody sending me a text message, a picture of some of the topics that were up for discussion, I think. And it was, again, there's a big sort of sport and leisure, sports science sort of department within this university
yes,
as well.
There was one input from sports professors,
Yeah, and one of them was, is art sport? And I just thought, well, if ever there was a philosophical line of inquiry, it's that. There's other things around, you know, what's wrong with taking drugs, and what that reminded me of my grandfather, sort of said years and years ago, because there was a new, in his block of flats in Barry where he was living, there was a youngster who would sort of smoke out the window, and he used to watch him, my grandfather, and think that's a bit suspicious. Is that because he's smoking drugs? And I remember my grandfather asking me, so Russell, but what's wrong with drugs? And it was this kind of, I can't talk about drugs with your granddad. I mean, it's, you know, that's just, and it was that, and when it was the topic, kind of reminded me of that conversation. But it's that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, actually, what is wrong with it?
That is received wisdom, isn't it? Because so
Absolutely.
often we talk about drug misuse, where maybe we ought to talk about drug use. And we talk about the problem of unwanted pregnancies or the problem of teenage pregnancies. Well, those pregnancies might not be unwanted, and they might not be a problem.
And we have this issue at the moment. I spoke about this within the Communities First programme, but I think it goes beyond that. It's around this notion that government in all parts of the UK, frankly, will put money into community activity, then community immersed based development, regeneration work, whatever you might want to describe it, or however government wants to describe it, and there's support available for people as long as they want to get a job, as long as there's a job outcome. We hear this a lot, and actually, what is wrong with people saying, well, I'm just going to care? Whether that's in a more formal sense, for relatives, for children, for older relatives, or actually in a more of a neighbourly sort of sense. And I can remember growing up in different communities where you had people that didn't appear to do a lot of work in the traditional sense, but they were always around and about and helping and checking in, and they performed that important cohesion role within communities. But increasingly, particularly in areas of disadvantage, we're sort of saying, no, everybody needs to be looking to get work or get more hours. And I don't know, I think it is a potential inquiry, philosophically speaking, to sort of say, actually, well, is work, or should it be that compulsory for all people?
We had a similar discussion around this at the Raymond Williams Foundation, because one of the things that Raymond Williams is known for is he produced a glossary of terms which was called keywords, and it was his definition of how words have taken on different cultural meanings. And we're currently working in the Raymond Williams Foundation on sort of looking at a modern version of keywords. There are lots of keywords projects going on. One at the University of Pittsburgh, for example, which is a very formal one, but we're doing it on a voluntary basis at RWF. And one of the words we started to look at was voluntarism. And a lot of the stuff that you're just talking about there came in there, and things like being neighbourly, caring for people, and so on. And I think keywords is a really good way of getting people to start looking at, again, coming on to the received wisdom terminology, is should it all be about employment? Should it all be about preventing pregnancies? Should it all be about preventing people from taking drugs, if that's a perfectly ethical and an okay thing to be doing, if it simply doesn't fit in with government policy? So I hope that you will take the opportunity to try to talk to Derek Tatton about the Keywords projects.
Would love to. And I can remember there was some stuff because the National Eisteddfod was in Monmouthshire last year, principally in Abergavenny, and you talk about Pandy and it not being sort of too far away. And I think there was some stuff at the Eisteddfod around Raymond Williams and his legacy and his work and things like that. So I didn't get there.
On the Raymond Williams Foundation website, we've posted some of the outcomes of some of the discussions and the dialogues we've had about some of these words, and a lot of them I think will be of interest to community development workers.
And presumably that would be a good place to start then. If people are interested in Raymond Williams and his work, that would be a useful place to start.
The foundation website. Yes, yeah, absolutely, because it's more of an accessible community type site, whereas the Raymond Williams Society, which is equally valuable, is much more an academic society.
You're pulling a sort of not quite sure on that one face.
No.
Doesn't work in an audio context.
No, that is true what I just said. But the reason why I was thinking, because the Raymond Williams Society is struggling and it might be merging with the foundation, but actually I don't think that's happened yet, so I think it's okay just to put that out there.
Jan, it's been an absolute pleasure. No doubt could philosophise for longer with you, and I'm sure there's other things that we can get around the mic and discuss around sort of community development in the future. But until then, diolch yn fawr, thank you very much. And if you want to follow you on Twitter, you are at
Minnie Keats.
MINNIE, we'll have some links to it, but KEATS. The Raymond Williams Foundation and societies, are they on sort of social media as well as websites?
The Raymond Williams Foundation has a Facebook page. Philosophy in Pubs has a Facebook page, but there's more than one Philosophy in Pubs Facebook page because there's more than one Philosophy in Pubs group, but there was one for the National Philosophy in Pubs, and there's a Philosophy in Pubs website.
Go to Google, you know what to do. Other search engines are available. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed these and some of the other episodes that we've put together, this is a new podcast we're looking to do that aims to, I suppose, sort of share learning, share frustrations, share values around community development work, community development sector, the community development workforce, and whether that's a formal salaried workforce, whether it's the unpaid, the voluntarism that you were talking about, Jan. So please get in touch on Twitter as @comdevd, DEVT podcast, the CD podcast, and please share if you've liked what you've heard, and please share it with your networks. We've talked a lot about sort of Cardiff today and in a Welsh context, but this isn't just about Wales. You mentioned Liverpool, for instance, and this sort of philosophy in pubs, this approach exists not just in the UK as well, but abroad. So we're looking to try to broaden the appeal of this podcast, not to beyond the borders of Wales and the UK, indeed to go beyond that. So please share that, and until next time, thank you.